knows what is in the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God.
Leave that. All right. So, back in August, my dad and I went up to uh, Wyoming, and we went backpacking in the Bighorn Mountains. Specifically, we went to Cloud Peak Recreational Wilderness Area, and this is the trailhead that we happen to be starting from, and I got a picture. I have a group photo too, but this one. So the Bighorn Mountains are 190,000 acres of spruce and pine-covered mountains, hundreds of miles of trails. It's home to elk and moose and black bears and hundreds of fish, but you only see the fish if you go looking for them in the lakes and go fishing, and none of us had fishing permits, so we didn't do that. But there's hundreds of little lakes dotted throughout the area, and we went up here. Dad had been once before, year previous, and he really enjoyed it, and was like, Ian, I think you're gonna enjoy it too. You should come with me this time. So I went up there, and I gotta tell you guys, it is beautiful. This is, so there's a little stream crossing here. You can't really see very well. In the upper right corner there, that's my dad and one of the other guys crossing a stream, and they've got their walking sticks out. One of the guys brought poles. Dad's just using the stick he found, like, conveniently left at the stream crossing so that you could use it to help get across. It's not too hard. Thankfully, most of these stream crossings, there's enough rocks that you can kind of step from one to the other. But keeping your balance is more difficult when you have 50 pounds of gear on your back. So the sticks come in really handy for that part. And so we made it up to this nice little meadow here, and that's where we made camp. That's Dad's tent there in the picture you can see. And then in the upper left corner, that's other side of the meadow looking across towards where we camped. And so we hiked up Friday afternoon, made camp Friday evening, and luckily there's a stream running through this meadow, kind of down the middle. And so that was our source of fresh water. We still had to purify it either through filtration or by boiling it. But at this altitude, we started, the car was parked at 8,500 feet in elevation. Where we camped was closer to 9,400. And water boils pretty easily at that temperature, or at that altitude, less air pressure. But you still have to wait for it to cool down, which is fun. So source of fresh water conveniently close by, beautiful grassy meadow. And then on Sabbath, we took a day mainly for the rest of the guys to acclimate to the higher altitude and the less oxygen that's up there. And we spent the afternoon, or most of the day pretty much, by the lake there in the bottom left corner, which is called Devil's Lake. I didn't pick the name, but that's where we spent Sabbath. So then Sunday morning, we get up, again, we leave all our stuff at the campsite, and we continue up the trail the rest of the way to a mountain pass to Emerald Lake. And at the top of the pass, there's bottom right corner, that's a marker that marks like the highest point in the pass. It's just a pile of rocks, and they put a stick in it, because at this point, you're now above the tree line. And I was the first one of the group to make it. And so this photo, the main one there, is facing south across the pass. And the wind is very strong coming up over the mountain, getting funneled into that valley and coming straight at me. And I didn't really bring a I had long sleeves, but I didn't bring like a coat really of any kind. So that was pretty cold. So I hunkered down behind that little rock and I got my hat on. And what I did was I threw down my hat in that little crevice there, and I just used that as a pillow and I lay down and took a break. Had a nice little 45-minute nap. And in that top right picture, I don't know if you can see that, the clouds started moving in. And, it started to get really, it looks really pretty, but like, man, I sure hope it doesn't rain. Well, guess what? It rained. In the main photo here, we took shelter. Ron, one of the other guys in the group, he was the first one of the rest of the group to make it up there. And so together we went and took shelter under this ledge. And you'll see now pretty much all the rest of the photos I have are going to be overcast. It didn't rain very hard or for very long, but it rained and we hid under there. We stayed relatively dry, but then of course everything else, like the grass we're walking through, is now wet, and all this other stuff. So the rain let up after a few minutes, and we went back and looked at, there's a series of lakes actually that run through the pass, and so I explored around a little bit more, got some more great photos. But after a while, I was worried about my gear back at camp. It rained up here in the pass. I should go back and check on my gear because that's where I was sleeping. Just had my hammock out, didn't put up a rain fly. I don't usually put a rain fly over my hammock when I sleep because usually it doesn't rain, first of all. And also, I like being able to look up and see the night sky, and it was the most beautiful night sky that I have ever seen. Well, the Northern Lights were pretty cool a while back, but the moon was so bright. Dad was telling me he woke up in the night and he had to go to the bathroom, and he looks out and he sees this bright light. He goes, "Oh, somebody else must have the same idea. It must be somebody's flashlight." And then so he waits a little bit and realizes the light's not moving. That's not a flashlight. That's just the moon shining on your tent. That's how bright it was. And the stars so clear, no light pollution of any kind out here. So I don't think anybody blames me for not wanting to cover my hammock with a rain fly and miss getting to look up at that as I fall asleep. The downside is that your stuff gets wet if you don't put a rain fly on it. So I got back to camp and I realized all my stuff's wet, and I started trying to lay my sleeping bag out on a rock, and maybe because that was the main thing. I was worried about that. The hammock can be damp, but as long as my sleeping bag's dry, I'd be okay. And it just wasn't going to happen. It stayed overcast the rest of the day. It would sprinkle a little bit and then stop, and then it would start again after another hour or so. There was just no way I was going to be able to dry this out. Also, we weren't allowed to have fires for two reasons. First of all, we're above the 9,200 elevation mark where we're not allowed to have fires, period. And also, they're under a fire warning, well, there were forest fires happening. In fact, we passed the signs of forest fires on the interstate on our way here. It had actually come up and crossed over the highway. So the day before we came out, that part of the road had been closed because the forest fires were there, but they'd moved on, so we were able to go backpacking anyways. So there was no way I was going to be able to dry out any of my gear. And I was thinking about perhaps the best option here is to just pack up everything, hike back to the car. It was like 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I'd make it down, be back at the car in a couple hours, be fine. Still have plenty of daylight to do that. And so I talked it over with my dad, and he agreed. And he goes, "Yeah, that's probably the best. Just head back to the car. The rest of the group's coming down in the morning anyways. Not a big deal." And so that's one thing actually that I'm grateful for, because I wasn't prepared for rain at any point in the thing. It's not like I took my rain fly off Sunday morning. I just never put it up. So I'm kind of lucky it didn't rain Friday night or Saturday at any point. So thankfully, if it's gonna rain, it rained the day before we were gonna go, and it wasn't too bad. I had checked the weather, by the way. I sort of knew what I was doing, but it's the mountain. The weather changes so quickly up there, you don't know. You don't know what's going to actually happen. So the trip was going to be mostly downhill, getting back to the car, and I was pretty sure, I was like, yeah, I'll make it back 2 hours, should be fine. plenty of time to get back to the car. And then I saw this. I thought, huh, that's either a really weird looking stump or it's a moose. And yeah, turns out it was in fact a moose. Let's see, this old rule. So first thing I did is I took my phone out and I took a little picture because like if something happens, I want documents what happened. But that's how far away he is, and that's the trail that I'm supposed to be continuing to get back to the car, and he's not that far off of it. So if I keep going down the path where I'm supposed to be going, I'm going to get closer to that moose, and that's not a great plan. So I took the picture. I took that initial photo thinking, at least if anything happens, they'll know what happened, because they'll be like, oh, hey, there's a picture of a moose on here. That explains a lot of things. Shot a quick little video, and I didn't use the audio here, but I narrated that, and it was like, hey, look, there's a moose over here. Here's the trail where I need to go. Moose is over there. And then got all that done, put my phone back in my pocket, and I took one little baby step forward, and he decides that he's going to stand up too. And he's a lot bigger when he's standing up. Yeah, there he is, fully stood up, looking right at me. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to wait back here for him to leave. And I took a bunch of pictures and I filmed a bunch of stuff. And so altogether, I was probably there. I have like 6 minutes of video and then a bunch of pictures I took. So I was probably there for 8 or 10 minutes, just kind of waiting for him to do something. And so anytime, eventually he started getting kind of more accustomed to me being there. And so anytime he would look kind of away and scratch himself with the sandals or something, just take a tiny little baby step forward and then wait. And then he'd move a little bit and I'd take another step forward. And finally I get close enough that he decides close is enough and walks off, crosses the stream here. The same stream that I'm going to have to cross here in a second. And the other nice thing is, at this point, there's actually trees in between me and him, as opposed to just a straight clear shot. But yeah, he crosses the stream. There's the trail you can see. And as I keep coming closer, he moves on. And eventually, he crosses the trail. First, I thought he was going to walk down the trail, but then he cuts off to the left there, and he was, and I have other pictures, they weren't as good, but he was back in that clump of trees as I passed by, and I was able to get back to the car, no further incidents. And so this is coming back out, Cloud Peak Wilderness, and then sleeping in the car. And even with that 10-minute nature break, I still made it back in my 2-hour time frame. Used a packing blanket to stay warm through the night. In the morning, I figured, arranged all my stuff and figured out what clothes were still clean and what clothes were still dry, and ran across. There was actually it's not plumb, but the state park bathrooms where it's just a brick or stone structure, but like has a throne in it. But it was nice and spacious, some room to kind of stand up, move around a little bit. So I went in there, cleaned up with some wet wipes that Mom sent, because moms think about that kind of thing, and got some dry, clean clothes on finally, and freshened up a little bit. And I come out the door, and it's been hailing on the ground. That's what all the white there is, tiny little pebbles of hail. And so I ended up having to dash back to the car. It didn't get too wet, but it ended up being a lot better coming down Sunday afternoon than it was Monday morning, because they all got drenched in the rain. And they come back looking like drowned rats, man. It was not as much fun. And they didn't get to see a moose either. So there's a couple takeaways from this story. But one that I want to focus on today is that my decision to leave the rain fly off ultimately is what led to me, out of everybody in the group, being the one who got to see a moose. If I'd put a rain fly on, my stuff would have been dry, and I would have been soaked. My coming down with everybody else. I didn't know that at the time. Hey, I'm going to leave this rain fly off so that it'll rain, and then I'll go back to the car early, and then I'll get no way I would have been able to foresee that coming, right? But that's how it happened. The other experience, the takeaway from this experience, is how I was able to remain calm in the face of a moose. Because you saw that initial photo when he stood up. First of all, he's a really big guy, and there's nothing in between me and him. There's no trees, there's no rocks, there's nothing for cover. And I've got long legs, but he's got longer legs, and 4 of them. If he wanted to come at me, there's no time to duck or duck. And I got gear on my, yeah, would not have been good. Apparently, according to the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, there are more moose attacks in a year than there are bear attacks, at least in Alaska. I couldn't find numbers for the Bighorn Mountains. But in the mountains, there's anywhere from 300 to 600 meese. Sorry, it's moose. I know it's singular. It's also plural. And there aren't any numbers on black bears, but there are black bears. There's no grizzlies in the bighorns. There are black bears. And apparently, nobody wants to pay people to study the black bears in the bighorns or just in general. So couldn't find any numbers on that. But in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, which includes the Bighorn Mountains, but also Yellowstone Park and Grand Teton and Jackson Hole and a bunch of area of kind of southwestern Wyoming and stuff, there's anywhere from 500 to 650 in that entire system. So much less common in the Bighorns comparatively. So here's what you're supposed to do if you encounter a moose in the wild and it's going to attack you. First of all, get behind a tree, a rock, or some other obstruction. Don't corner the moose. Make sure it has a way to exit so it doesn't feel cornered. Curl up into a ball and protect your head with your hands and hold still. And don't move or try to get up until the moose moves a safe distance away. Out of all these things, none of which I knew at the time, out of these, other than don't corner the moose and make sure it has a way to exit, I didn't do any of these. Eventually I was behind some trees, but I had to actually get closer to the moose to put trees between myself and it. So that kind of counteracts the other one about don't move up or get closer to it. And I just kind of stood there. I didn't curl up into a ball or anything. Remind you, this is how far away, well, I'm zoomed in a little bit, but this is how far away he is. There's nothing in between me and him other than some logs that I wouldn't have any trouble stepping over. He surely wouldn't have trouble stepping over. So you want to know the rules that I followed in this situation to make it through this encounter without harm? The first thing I did was I prayed like crazy. Lord, this is cool, but please keep me safe. Mainly, I was thanking God for this marvelous opportunity, but also I was really praying that, He would keep me safe. Especially because I was all by myself. The rest of the group was still at camp, and they weren't going to be coming through until the next morning. So if anything happens, I was very much on my own. And the other part of that, of course, was to go slow. Just take your time, let him be accustomed, don't let him ever feel threatened. And so between these two things, that's it. That's all I did. So I want to go back and I want to take a look at that verse. Romans 8:23. And this verse gets me through a lot. If anything, I tend to go the other direction and expect that things are going to work out even when they, like, maybe I should be a little bit more concerned, maybe I should be a little bit more involved in the situation. But it says, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. So I would like to take some time, and we're going to pick this verse apart kind of piece by piece. So he starts off, and we know. It is our knowledge, according to the eternal purpose of God, that all things will contribute to the welfare of those who love him, even in troubles and suffering of this life, far from hindering our salvation. those things, troubles and tribulations, will help forward our salvation. At every step, the Christian may be in the hands of God and be carrying out the divine purpose. So the next part, we know that all things, evidently Paul intended this to be understood in the widest possible sense, right? All things is all encompassing, right? And so if you look at the Romans chapter 8, he mentions in a few other verses other things. So verse 35, he says, 18, he talks about the sufferings of this present time. Verse 35, he says, who shall separate us from the love of God? Shall trial, tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or danger, or sword? All these things, all those situations that we may find ourselves in are working for God's purpose. Verses 38 and 39, he says, for I am sure that neither death nor life, nor angels nor rulers, nor things present or things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. So these are the things he's talking about. All of these things, anytime you encounter any of those things, whether it's getting your hammock rained on because you didn't feel like putting a rain flip, because the sky was just so pretty, God, why'd you make it look so good? Or encountering a moose all by yourself on a trail, all these things are going to work together for God's purpose, for the glory of him. So all things work together for good. Nothing can touch the Christian except by our Lord's permission, and we see that in the first couple chapters of Job before we go into the long monologues there. Job talks about, how, I'll just pull it up. I was going to summarize, but then reading is better. Job chapter 1, verse 6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan, or the accuser, the adversary, the Hebrews kind of had a different term for him that is used throughout these 2 chapters, was also among them. The Lord said to Satan, from where have you come? Satan answered the Lord, from going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it. And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in this land. But stretch out your hand and touch all he has, and he will curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. So the only time that we are allowed to experience these trials and tribulations and nakedness and all these other things are when God allows it. And he will only allow that for ultimately good reasons. And it doesn't always feel like that. And Job sure had some complaining, but ultimately he never blamed God. He never spoke against God through all the suffering that he went through. If God permits suffering and perplexity to come upon us, it is not to destroy us, but to refine and sanctify us. We see Paul talks about that in verse 17 of chapter 8 here. The troubles and disappointments of this life take our affections from the world and lead us to look to heaven for our home. They teach us the truth about our frail and dying condition and cause us to rely upon God for support and for salvation. They also produce in us a more humble and subdued spirit, a more patient and tender disposition. This has been the experience of God's people throughout history, and at the end of their lives, they have been able to say that it was good for them to have been so afflicted. And David writes about this in the Psalms and such, right? At the end of his life, Joseph was able to say to his brothers, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good. And we're going to look at that story more here in a minute. All right, so we know that all things work together for good to those who love God. In the Greek, this phrase is placed in a position of emphasis, right? The words describe the true followers of God, those who have real faith and who trust in God's leading. Their love for God is in response to God's love for them and his divine working in all things for their salvation. The love of God must first come to a man and enter his heart before he, in turn, can love God. 1 John 4:19 tells us that. as the Holy Spirit must first enlighten a man if he is to pray as he is supposed to, which we see here in Romans chapter 8. Paul talks about that as well. Paul has already spoken about God's love towards us in the previous chapter 5, and he mentions it again here later on. He also speaks a number of times about our love for fellow men throughout this letter, but this is the most specific reference in the letter to our love toward God. Faith has been frequently mentioned, and hope has been the subject of the preceding verses in this chapter, but now Paul adds to that list not just faith, but love for God. Of course, every reference to faith is also implies also that there is a love, because that's what faith is based on. So, and we know all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called, or to them that love God. And so, those who are called implies that the call has been accepted. And so Christians, for Christians, the term called, or they are called because God has given us the gospel message, right, and has invited us to be saved. Salvation is never forced upon an unwilling sinner, but comes as the result of his freely accepting an invitation. Along with the call, God sends into the heart an influence of the Holy Spirit to make the call effectual. Those who love God have in their own experience the evidence that they have been called according to his purpose, for the call has produced the intended effect. So finally, we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. And purpose here, refers to God's eternal purpose to save sinners by grace. And since it is the purpose of him who worketh all things after the counsel of his own will, Ephesians 1:11, it follows that all things must work together for good to the called according to that purpose of being saved. So whatever it is we're going through, ultimately, it's God at work. And it's not always easy to see that. Really quick, I'm not going to put the verses on the screen, but we're going to take a look at the story of Joseph. And I'm going to summarize most of this and try to get us to a couple points, but I just want to refresh it in your minds mainly. That's all notes. Okay. So Genesis 37, if you want to follow along in your Bibles, we're going to do the Cliff Notes version of this. Genesis 37 is where Joseph's troubles start. He was 17 at the time, it tells us in verse 2, and he was attending to the flock with his brothers that were born from Bilhah and Zilpah, which are the handmaidens of the two women that Jacob married, and then they couldn't have kids, so they had that. Anyways. So like half brothers, I guess. And so he was attending the flocks with the two brothers, and he brings back a bad report of them. And they don't like that. Nobody likes a tattletale. That all happens in verse 2. He's 17, and he gives a bad report. Verse 3, now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. And naturally, his brothers hated him even more because of this favoritism. I don't think it technically counts as nepotism if everybody involved is related, so yeah, favoritism. Verses 5 through 8, Joseph has a dream where they're binding sheaves out in the field, right? It's been cut with the sickle, and now they have to collect it and stand it up in a bundle. I think so it can dry was the idea. So it's not like laying on the damp ground. And so they're collecting the cut wheat, and they tie it together in a bundle. And Joseph's in the dream, Joseph's bundle jumps out of his arms, and it stands up straight, and all the bundles of all his brothers jump out of their arms, and they like bow down to the bundle that Joseph had been holding. And so he tells his brothers about this, and they're like, oh yeah, like you're going to be in charge of us? And they hate him even more because he has these, illusions of like he's superior to everybody, or so this dream would seem to indicate. And then verses 9 through 11, Joseph has another dream where the sun, the moon, and 11 stars. So now, not just his brothers, but his father and mom's, or his father's wives, all bow down to him. And even his father rebukes him this time and is like, that's not going to happen. And at least his father kept the saying in mind. It says that he remembered what Joseph had said. So, verse 12, Jacob sends Joseph out from the valley of Hebron. And this is the point where I want to put a map. Oh, you can't read any of that. Okay, perfect. It's fine. I have arrows. So that's Shechem. This is the valley of Hebron. Well, that is Hebron, and the valley would be like the area around it. So in verse 12, Jacob asks Joseph to travel from where they are, where the arrow is, up to Shechem. So he would have followed the road up here and all the way up there to Shechem, which is about 55 miles, depending on like where in the valley they were and various things. So on foot, this could have taken him 2 or 3 days. And there doesn't seem to be any indication in the story that he was on horseback or camel or anything, so probably 2 or 3 day journey on foot. And he gets to Shechem in verse 17, and he finds out that they aren't in Shechem, they're in Dothan, which is all the way up here. So another half day, maybe a full day if he took it slow, to find his brothers where the flock is. And they recognize him. Verse 18, it says his brothers recognize him from a distance, probably because he's wearing a really bright-colored coat, and nobody else would do that. And so they decide that they start plotting against Joseph. And they said, when he gets here, let's kill him and throw him in a pit, which must have really hated him at this point, for that to be their first thought. But verses 21 and 22 tell us that Reuben intervenes and says, let's not kill our brother. He's our own flesh and blood. The pit idea is really good, though. I'm on board with that. Let's throw him in the pit, but let's leave him alive when we do it. And so, because 22 says, secretly he planned to come back and take him out and send him back to their father, without the rest of the brothers knowing. So verses 24 through 27, they take his bright-colored robe and they throw him in this pit. There's no water. It's dry. And then they sit down for lunch. And you can't really tell, but there's a road that kind of follows that outer edge along the sea there, called the Way of the Sea. And that would be a very popular travel for caravans on their way down to Egypt, because Egypt is kind of down that bottom left corner, starts getting closer to Egypt there. So as they're sitting down for lunch, they see caravans coming, and they set and then they decide. Judah suggests, let's not kill Joseph, because Reuben's right. That's bad. We shouldn't do that. He's our own flesh and blood. But if we sell him, we can get money and be rid of our brother. It's a win-win for the brothers. And so that's what they do. And they sell him to a band of Midianites, and they would have traveled along this road here all the way down to, at the very least, to Gaza, which is where the arrow is pointing. They could have continued on down the road across the Sinai Peninsula and into the Nile Delta, which eventually is where Joseph ended up at, because that's where the land of Goshen is when his family moves to Egypt. But we'll get to that. Leave it on this one. Okay. So, verse 30, at the end of chapter 37, we're told that Joseph is sold into slavery, and he's sold to Potiphar, who is the captain of Pharaoh's guards. 38 is a different story, but 39 comes back to Joseph, and in verses 2 and 3 it says, the Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So even going from being the favorited son of a rather large family to being sold into slavery, the Lord's still with him. He's still working for good. Joseph, and I don't think anybody, especially when the brothers decide that they're going to sell their brother off, they don't know where this is going. They just think, he'll be gone. He'll be out of the way. Won't have to worry about it. But Joseph has that diligent Christian work ethic, right? He has the Lord's blessing. The Lord blesses him. Verse 4, he gets promoted to overseer, and the entire household is now being blessed on behalf of Joseph because God is with him. Unfortunately, verse 6 tells us that Joseph was a good-looking guy. And verse 7 explains why that's a bad thing, because Potiphar's wife kept trying to get him in bed with her. And again, being a morally upright young man, 19, 20 at the time, maybe, tells, he's having nothing to do with that. But unfortunately, she accuses him anyways. He leaves his coat, and he blames Potiphar. And I was looking at this. I was curious to see, like, what the laws would have been at the time, like, what they would have called for. And it's kind of hard to tell because old times. But there is at least an indication that social standing would have had something to do with that. So because he was, and it would have been worse because she was married, but not as bad because Joseph was like a high-ranking slave, but had a position of authority at least, and some respect within the household, which is potentially part of why Potiphar didn't just have him executed and sent him to prison instead. So anyways, that's where he ends up. He ends up in prison. Genesis 40 talks about Joseph meets the king's cupbearer and the baker, who had offended Pharaoh for some reason and ended up in prison. And verse 4 says, the captain of the guard, and I'm assuming this isn't Pharaoh's guard because that's Potiphar and we've already met him, so the guard, like captain of the prison guard probably, appointed Joseph to be with them and attended to them, and they continued for some time in custody. So a lot of time is elapsing here. We don't really know how long these things have been going on. But at the end of 37 and the beginning of chapter 39, we're told that Potiphar, no, that was the Potiphar thing. Okay. I'm not going to go into the dreams the two had, but basically one morning, Joseph's like, hey, you guys look like you had a rough night. What's going on? They tell him about the dreams. He says, here's what those dreams mean. And one's good, one's bad. And turns out in 3 days, they were both right, which is interesting because the 3 days was also part of the, for lack of a better term, prophecy that Joseph made. When he deciphered those dreams and explained the meaning, the 3 days period was included in that explanation. And so 3 days later, it's Pharaoh's birthday, and turns out Joseph was right. And Joseph had told the chief cupbearer, when you are restored to your former position, remember me, mention me to your boss, the Pharaoh, and maybe he can get me out of here because I didn't do anything wrong. 2 years later, Joseph's still in prison. So he was 19, because he was 17 when all this started, but we don't know how much time elapsed, how long he was at Potiphar's house, how long he was, well, at least 2 years in prison, so he's at least 19. But it's possible he could have been 25, 26, maybe even almost turning 27. My birthday's coming up if you didn't know that. Pharaoh has two dreams in the same night. He has the first one, wakes up in a cold sweat, goes back to sleep finally, has the second one. He doesn't understand either of them, which seems to be a routine for foreign kings that don't follow God. They have weird dreams and they can't explain them until they find a servant of God to explain it to them. The chief cupbearer finally remembers the guy. Oh yeah, weird dreams, Joseph. Let's get him in here. So Joseph is taken out of the prison, shaves, cleans up, and comes before Pharaoh. Pharaoh tells what his Joseph explains not just what happened or what the dreams foretell, but he also says, because you're about to have 7 years of prosperity, you should take 1/5 of everything and set it aside so that when the 7 years of famine come, we have a lot. And that 1/5 is going to be a large amount, even though it's not a big percentage, because everybody's going to be producing more than they normally do. So let's collect while there's plenty, and we'll be ready for when there's not. Egypt was the only country that knew about this and was making preparations for this famine, so when it happened, they were ready. Which explains why his brothers have to eventually come to Egypt to buy grain. And Joseph, of course, impressed Pharaoh with not only the explanation of the dreams, but his suggestion. And Pharaoh could see that God was with Joseph, and he goes, whatever you do gets blessed by your God. I'm putting you in charge of this really important national project so that we'll be able to survive this upcoming famine. And so finally, Joseph is reunited with his brothers, and chapter 45, verses 4 through 5. So Joseph said to his brothers, and this whole time he's been using a translator, but he understands their customs, so he's been kind of honoring that, but they didn't tell him what those were, which kind of, some weird stuff's been going on. Finally, Joseph says to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And they came near, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life." It's come full circle now. Joseph has realized why he was sent to Egypt, why his brothers sold him into slavery. Is that the route that Joseph would have preferred to end up there? Probably not. He went through a lot of hardship getting to that point, but he was able to, in a real, physical sense, save a lot of people. And so those trials that we go through are, spiritual trials we go through are helping us get to a position where we will be saved. And we're not going to necessarily be in a position to save the entire known world, but at least our own souls will be saved because of this. So one more time, the whole family moves to Egypt, to the fruitful Goshen, which is like right on the end of the delta, and eventually Jacob dies, and they travel back to where he had built a tomb for himself, and they get back to Egypt, and they're back to their normal lives, and Joseph's brothers send word to him, and they're worried. They're worried that Joseph was only playing nice because their father was still alive, and he didn't want his father to suffer anymore with more feuding between the brothers. So after the father's dead, and they're back in Egypt, they're back to their normal lives, they send word to him, they're like, "Look, we're really sorry about what we did. Please have mercy on us. Please don't hate us. Don't do anything mean." And Joseph says to them, Genesis 50, 19, and 20, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." So, close on that, but I just want you to remember when those hardships come, whatever course your life seems to be taking, God is steering, He has control, and He's picking the best path for you, best so that you're saved, not necessarily the easiest. So when those struggles start to happen, just keep that in mind, that God is at work, and He only wants the best for you. At this point, we're going to sing our closing hymn, number 547, "Leadeth Me."